Thank you. Thank you for the very kind invitation and the chance to be here with you. Thanks to Vince and Deanna, dear friends from many, many years back. Both were part of our church community in Cambridge and Boston. And so thankful for our friendship over the years and the way we've learned and grown together as families and as well as brothers and sisters in Christ. In fact, I wouldn't be here if it weren't for Vince and Deanna. The last 3 days, Wednesday through Friday, I was at a conference in Atlanta, and I just got back last night, just in time for family night at home on Friday night, and then I had to catch the first flight out this morning, and then Monday, I'm actually flying out again to North Carolina. From there, I'll be in another city. I actually don't remember what city I'm in after that. But I've been in kind of a slew of travel. There's like 3 different places I'm going back to back to back. And when I saw the schedule, I said, I'm not sure I can do this, and I said, no, if Vince and Deanna asked, then I'm going to be there, no matter what it takes to get here. So I'm so thankful for the partnership and friendship over the years. Let me say a word of prayer as we begin to look at God's Word together this morning. God, I am thankful for the work that is going on here in St. Louis and the work that you're doing all over our nation and over our world. Every time we see what's going on and see maybe the conflicts, the turmoil, the troubles, the bad news that we see all around us, we can be devastated by knowing that this world is broken, fallen, a victim to sin and evil, and all the things that we can degrade about the world around us. But we see the glimmers of hope in communities like this. We see the promises of your kingdom in the churches that are represented here, the individuals, the communities that are represented here. So we take that very seriously. We believe that not only because this is a church building, but because of those who have gathered, this truly is holy ground. And we come to that with fear and trembling, knowing that we are worshiping a God who is able to do immeasurably more than we could ever hope or imagine, and that is to bring out of the depths of sinfulness and brokenness a community that rises up and demonstrates to the world that our God is indeed alive. Our God indeed is an awesome God. So I pray for the churches that are here, that you would indeed work through them and to demonstrate to this world, to this fallen world, that the church is alive and well, and the church can do immeasurably more than they could ever hope or imagine. We pray this in your name. Amen. I'm going to take us through a little bit of my latest book, which is A Prophetic Lament, and it is a commentary on Lamentations. And as my wife, I worked on this book for almost 20 years, and then I started engaging in the book of Lamentations 20 years ago. When we first started our church in Cambridge, the first full sermon series I did was actually in the book of Lamentations, which is not a good idea if you're starting a church, not the most seeker-sensitive, user-friendly book of the Bible. But I started that because I thought it was an important message for the generation that was seeking to exhibit God's truth in the world. But the writing of it took about 5 years, and my wife would joke that you're working on this for 5 years, you're going to sell about 4 copies, because nobody cares about Lamentations. Nobody wants anything to do with a book that boring and that depressing. But what I want to talk about, though, is that the need to engage the whole story of the Bible, and not just parts of the Bible that we like. And that is also true in the whole story of God at work in our communities, and not just part of the story that we like. So we're going to talk today about Lamentations and how we need to maybe have some disruption in our lives in order for there to be health, in order for there to be the fullness of God. Sometimes we need a little disruption. I'll explain this through an illustration. I'm at a particular age where I've made the same New Year's resolution for the last 15 years. And I make it every year because I'm not living up to that resolution. And the resolution is to lose a little bit of weight and get a little more fit. Every year I make it, every year I fail. So this past year I said I'm going to really take this seriously. I'm going to do what professors do, which is to research the topic as thoroughly as possible. So I go to the best tool for research, Google, and I Google what is the best exercise regimen for a person in America right now. Turns out, I don't know if you've heard of this, there's something called CrossFit. Anybody heard of this? CrossFit? P90X is another version of this. CrossFit and P90X, I didn't do it, by the way. It's too hard. But CrossFit and P90X use a philosophy of exercise that I really appreciate. The philosophy is called muscle confusion. And I love that philosophy because that's my philosophy my entire life. And the way I've applied it in my life is I don't work out for months and months. And when I finally go to the gym, my muscles are really confused by and then they go away. I don't know what happens. The idea of muscle confusion, that it's okay to actually create or introduce confusion or disruption, and that sometimes leads to better health. And if that's true in the physical world, that kind of disruption is actually a good thing, could that also be true in the spiritual world? That there are times when we need some kind of disruption in order for our health in the spiritual realm to be better and to be more fit in the spiritual realm. So I want us to take us on a journey through Lamentations and the background of Lamentations that hopefully would direct us towards an understanding of what it means to be on fire followers of Jesus in this broken world, but that sometimes that might mean a disruption that would lead us further along that path of spiritual health and well-being. Let me give you the background. If you have the slides up, I'll put the slides up for the... let me give you a little bit of background of the book of Lamentations. Some of you are already familiar with it. I'm just going to do a quick background. You can turn to the Lamentations chapter 1, verse 3 passage, which is the 4th slide. The context of the book of Lamentations is that Jerusalem has experienced a tremendous fall. Israel has experienced a tremendous fall. So most of you know the story. The one slide below, right before that, Lamentations chapter 1, verse 3. Most of you know the story. David and Solomon are great leaders and kings. They established the great kingdom in Israel. They're a power during their time. David's a great military leader. Solomon's a great economic leader. So under their reign, you have this great military power, economic power in the ancient Near East. We also know, if you read through the rest of the Bible, that community doesn't continue to live in health, in that we find out that the following kings after David and Solomon were not as godly, were not as holy, and so they lead Israel astray to follow idols and to worship false gods. And after many generations of that, as you know, the people of Israel had to be judged for their disobedience, for their idolatry. So God first brings Assyrians from the northern kingdom down to wipe out the northern kingdom of Israel, and then the Babylonians come, wipe out the southern kingdom of Israel, and eventually the only thing left is the city of Jerusalem, the capital of Israel. And then the Babylonians lay siege to that city and eventually wipe out Jerusalem. The Babylonians are really upset. Jerusalem was just kind of this, they were getting in the way. And they said, we don't want Jerusalem to get in our way anymore, so we're going to devastate that city completely. So what they do is they destroy the fields, they burn it, but not only burn it, but salt the fields, so that the fields could not grow crops, not just for one season, but for multiple seasons. So a land once flowing with milk and honey was now a barren desert. They went in, as you know, they conquered Jerusalem, they wiped out the entire city. They tore down the temple, they tore down the palace, they took all the gold and silver, anything that was precious in those temples, in that temple, and they took it away into exile. Along with, as we know, the exile, which is what's happening here. After affliction and harsh labor, Judah has now gone into exile. So the ultimate punishment that Babylon can bring upon Israel and to Jerusalem is to say, not only are we going to destroy your city now, but we're not even going to allow you to fix your city years from now. And the best way to do that was not only to take all the gold and silver and materials from Jerusalem, but to take their most precious resource, which is human resources. So what they did is they took all those who were the prophets, the priests, the kings, those who could read or write, those who had any capacity they felt to rebuild the city of Jerusalem, they took them away into exile. And of course, you know, that's where we encounter the story of Daniel and his friends. They were among those who were the literate, the young men mostly, who had the capacity, they believe, to rebuild the city of Jerusalem. So now, once exile has occurred, who's left behind in the city of Jerusalem? Well, it's the crippled, the lame, the blind, the poor, the orphans, the widows, the sick, and those who essentially said, these are the most marginalized in our society. They're the leftovers. They're the ones that we don't believe are going to be able to restore Jerusalem. And so the only ones left behind would have been the poor, the crippled, the lame, and the blind, the widows, and the orphans. And then the rest are taken away into exile. So we're encountering a moment in Jerusalem and Israel's history, and the history of the people of God, where they are probably at their lowest point. Not only is their present destroyed, but their future really has no hope. Are they ever going to be able to rebuild Jerusalem? Well, not with the resources that they have. They've had everything taken away. And so there's a moment right now where the exiles and those who are left behind and the remnant in Jerusalem are at their lowest moment thinking, we've lost our status as God's people. And it is in that moment that Jeremiah writes a letter to the exiles. And we encounter that in the book of Jeremiah. Because if you go to the next slide, you'll see that there is a couple of potential options here. There's more than two, but I'm going to highlight two of them. The first option that God's people have when they're in exile and when they're devastated is to run away and hide and to give up. And to say, we're not God's people anymore. We live in a wicked world. We don't need to do it. We don't need to try anymore. We don't need to help out the world anymore. We just need to give up, run away, and we're going to hide. We're going to run away and hide. So that's the first option. And we encounter the challenge to that first option in Jeremiah 29, verse 4 through 7, a passage that many of you are familiar with. We go to the next slide. This is what the Lord Almighty, the God of Israel, says to all those I carried into exile from Jerusalem to Babylon. So now Jeremiah is writing to those who are in exile. Build houses, settle down, marry, have sons and daughters, give your daughters in marriage and your sons in marriage. Let them have children, do not decrease but increase. Verse 7, a passage that many of us might be familiar with. Seek the peace and prosperity of the city to which I have carried you into exile. Now think about that wording for a moment. 99.9 times out of the Bible, out of 100 in the Bible, when you see the phrase, seek the peace, what city is always associated with it? Seek the peace of Jerusalem. Almost without fail, with one or two other exceptions, it's always seek the peace of Jerusalem. Which completely makes sense, right? Jerusalem is God's city. It's the city of David, the capital of the promised land. We, of course, want to honor and seek the peace of Jerusalem. But here it says, what? Not seek the peace of Jerusalem, but seek the peace of Babylon. Of all places in the world to seek the peace of. This makes no sense to God's people. Because they're used to seeking the peace of Jerusalem, the heavenly city, and now all of a sudden we hear the phrase, seek the peace of Babylon. Of Babylon. What we're seeing here is God's people in the most wicked place imaginable. Every time you see the phrase Jerusalem versus Babylon, Jerusalem is the holy city, Babylon is the sinful city. Now, all throughout the Bible, all the way through the book of Revelation, Babylon is portrayed in the worst possible terms. It is the worst place on earth, according to the people of God at this time. And they're in the middle of the most sinful, broken, awful place in the world, and God still says, you're not allowed to give up. You are not allowed to give up. Even if you're in the place that you think is the most wicked place in the world, you are not allowed to give up. You may be called to Las Vegas, and you're not allowed to give up. You may be called to Washington, D.C., and you're not allowed to give up. The wicked places in the world, you are not allowed to give up. This passage reminds us that no matter where we are, whether we are in Jerusalem or even in Babylon, our option is never to run away and hide. Our call to be the people of God is consistent and persistent. It does not go away because of our circumstances. Now here's the problem though. The problem is that in American church history, there has been multiple places in our church's history where the church has done that. Run away and hid. Rather than saying the world is changing, we need to bring the gospel more so into this world, many times the churches have said, this is too scary for us. This is not what we wanted. This is not what we signed on for. So many times the church has run away and hid. Go to the next slide, you'll see this history. In the 17th century, when North America was being colonized and it was transitioning into the United States, there was this perception, right or wrong, there was this perception by the European conquerors that North America was going to be a city set on a hill. A place where the gospel was going to go forth. New Jerusalems and new Zions were going to come out of these urban centers in North America. You see this, of course, in John Winthrop, the first governor of Massachusetts, comes to the city of Boston, looks over Boston and says, I see a city set on a hill, taken straight from Scripture, talking about Boston as a new Jerusalem. Seeing Philadelphia, New York, and all these urban centers in the U.S. as urban centers of renewal and spiritual growth. Boston actually took that very seriously. And one of the most important neighborhoods in Boston is called Beacon Hill. And one of the most significant streets in the city of Boston is called Beacon Street, because it's trying to live into that idea of a new Jerusalem where the gospel goes forth. And that was the dominant narrative in American history for several centuries. From the 17th into the 18th, and even into the 19th, and some even into the 20th, but certainly into the 19th century, we heard the very strong story that American churches and American cities were going to be the place where the gospel goes forth. America was the new Jerusalem and the new Zion, and the gospel was going to go forth from these especially American urban centers. And that changes in the 19th into the 20th century because of two major historical occurrences. The first major historical occurrence is the transition in the 19th century from a northern and western European immigration to a southern and eastern European immigration. Now, with northern and western European immigration, you had mostly white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. You had Scottish Presbyterians, German Lutherans, you had Scandinavian Lutherans, Scandinavian Protestants. And that was okay because they were white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. But in the 19th century, the wave of new immigration comes from Europe, and they're not from Western and Northern, they're from Southern and Eastern Europe, and they are not Protestant, they are Italian Catholics. They are Greek Orthodox. They are Polish Jews. And now the urban centers, which had once been seen as cities set on a hill, began to transition not Jerusalem anymore, but to Babylon. Babylon. In fact, maybe the most confusing movie I ever saw was the movie Gangs of New York. Have you saw that movie? I saw it on DVD. I didn't see it in the theater. Everybody would say, you gotta see this movie. It's about race wars in New York. Cool, I love race war movies. So I said, I'm gonna get this movie. I rented it, slipped it into the DVD, and I got really confused. Because I'm watching this movie, it's supposed to be a race war in New York. And it's a gang led by Daniel Day-Lewis, the whitest man in Hollywood, facing off against Leonardo DiCaprio, the second whitest man in Hollywood. And how is this a race war when you've got Leonardo fighting against Daniel Day-Lewis? It didn't make sense to me. Until you realize this history. That the conflict was between the Western and Northern Europeans who saw themselves as the Native Americans or Nativist Americans, and the new Americans, or the interlopers, who were from Southern and Eastern Europe, and then you had racially tinged gang wars between these two different people groups in our urban centers in New York, Philadelphia, and all these other cities as well. But with the influx of non-Protestant, non-Western Europeans into these urban centers, the city's perception begins to change. I went through a number of journals that were written around this time when this is happening. And one of the journals said, our cities are no longer Jerusalems. Instead, they have become caves of rum and Romanism. Think about that language. Caves of rum and Romanism. So the white Anglo-Saxon Protestants who lived in these urban centers began to be fearful of the changes that were occurring in the city. Now the second half of the story is what really sealed the deal, which was the influx of African Americans from the southern states into the northern states, which of course we now know as the Great Migration. The Great Migration. After the Civil War ended, with the Emancipation Proclamation, there is an amazing conversion of African Americans in terms of officially joining churches and starting churches. Now there was Christianity, very amazing expressions of Christianity on the plantations. But once you experience emancipation, now you're able to experience the joining of churches, the starting of churches. So the official enrollment of African Americans as Christians, it's a massive number that are officially converted into Christianity because they start joining and starting churches post-Emancipation Proclamation. In fact, I argue as a professor of history and evangelism that that moment is the most significant evangelism effort ever in U.S. history. In terms of numbers, in terms of percentages, it is a far more successful revival than the Great Awakening, more than Billy Graham, more than any other kind of movement of God. That conversion or that revival within the African American community within one generation of Emancipation Proclamation is the most significant spiritual renewal in American church history. So it is that group that is spiritually fired up, that are starting Baptist, Methodist, Holiness, Pentecostal churches. And numbers going anywhere from 75 to 90% of African Americans have converted to Christianity within a generation post-Emancipation Proclamation. But that group, most of whom are living in the Mississippi Delta, are not finding jobs in the Mississippi Delta. Not going back to the plantation. Their efforts to communities. Most of those are burned up and destroyed by the Klan and white supremacists. So whereas the movement is for African Americans, there's no mobility or hope in the South, so they start moving into northern cities. Now, St. Louis is an interesting part of that because those are the folks who made it halfway. They might get to Chicago, but also live in the Mississippi Delta. I'm just kidding. So you have folks that are moving, leaving the South, and moving into these urban centers. Places like Chicago, places like Detroit, Cleveland, and places on the East Coast like Baltimore, Philadelphia, and New York. Within that 100 years after the Emancipation Proclamation, and it well past into the Second World War, you get this massive migration, the great migration of African Americans moving into these urban centers in northern and eastern cities. Now, again, remember that these are not unbelievers. These are fired-up Christians who start moving into these urban centers. In fact, if you look at the history of the megachurches in the U.S., the first megachurch in the U.S. was not Willow Creek, led by Bill Hybels. It was not Saddleback, led by Rick Warren. The first megachurches in the U.S. were African-American churches on the south side of Chicago. They were 2,000 members strong when the city was not even that big. There was a church in Detroit that had 10,000 members. Even way before the industrial wave into Detroit. So they have a 10,000 member church when the population was not. Those are amazing, powerful mega churches in these urban centers. So the movement of African Americans into the urban centers in Chicago, Detroit, Baltimore, Philadelphia, the starting of A&E churches, the starting of Baptist churches, Pentecostal churches, holiness churches, all over these urban centers meant a spiritual renewal and revival in these urban communities. God was moving among the African American communities and bringing spiritual renewal to these urban centers. But the same white Anglo-Saxon Protestants who saw Southern and Eastern Europeans as a threat saw African Americans, even though they were fired up evangelical Christians, they saw these individuals as a threat as well. And now we're saying, out of the fear of our housing prices are going to drop, our schools are not going to be good anymore, our neighborhoods are not safe anymore, using that language, many of the white Anglo-Saxon Protestant churches fled the city and moved out into the suburbs. We, of course, have documented this as white flight. One of the ways that you can notice this change is the new buildings that get started right around this time. So the height of this white flight is actually post-World War II through the next several decades. And if we go to the next slide, you see that Winthrop Hudson did a study on how much money was spent on new church buildings in a particular time period. In 1945, only $26 million were spent on new church buildings in the United States. That's probably how much one mega church spends on their parking lot these days. So it's not a whole lot of money. 26 million, you really think about it, that's not a whole lot of money. In the entire US, $26 million was spent, according to Winthrop Hudson. By 1960, 15 years later, that number jumps to $1 billion spent on new church buildings. Why? Because whites were fleeing the city, leaving those buildings behind, and running out into the suburbs and building new churches in the suburbs. So instead of saying, God is at work in our city, look at the revival that African American churches are bringing into our city. Look at the opportunity to share the gospel with my Eastern European neighbors. The community there said, no, it's time to run away and hide. It's time to flee. And that was actually pretty indicative of the buildings. These buildings, the $1 billion that was spent on buildings, you see a lot of buildings that look like this. Go to the next slide. It's hard to tell here, if you can't make it out, just kind of look up at the building that we're in right now. The buildings that were built in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, a huge number of them, if not all, a huge percentage of them, have architecture in their sanctuary that looks like this. Particularly in the Midwest, you'll see a lot of church buildings built in the middle of the century that look like this. It's essentially kind of a slanted roof with a little bit of an arch on the side. How many of you have seen church buildings like this, been in church buildings like that? A lot of them, they were probably built in the 40s, 50s, 60s, and some into the 1970s. Now, I was at a building dedication in about 1978 at a building that looked almost exactly like this building. And as a 10, 11-year-old, I said, this is a really stupid idea. I don't know whose idea it was to build a building like this, but this is not a good idea. I was in a cold weather state in the middle of February when they were dedicating this building, and all the heating vents are on the floor. Where does all the wonderful hot air go on a cold February Sunday morning? Right up into the rafters. So you literally have the frozen chosen in the pews, and all this wonderful hot air up there. And then now you've got to build ceiling fans and to push down all the hot air, and the charismatics can't worship because when they raise their hands, they're hitting their hands on their ceiling fans. So you end up with a form of architecture, and 11 years old, I said, this is a really stupid idea. I'm saying to myself, whose idea was I'm freezing in here, the hot air is all up here, whose idea was it to build this building like this? The senior pastor gets up and he says, it was my idea to build a sanctuary to look like this. And he explains why. And he says, go to the next slide, I want you to picture the entire building turned upside down. And what does that look like? And he says, you're looking at a really big boat. You're looking at a really big ship. And where in the Bible do you read about a really big boat? Go to the next slide. Noah's Ark. Of course. Noah's Ark is where you read about a really big ship, about a really big boat. And so what we did was we developed a church ministry centered around being comfortable in a Noah's Ark version of Christianity for the 20th century. Now, what we did then is we said, all right, we'll take the stuff we like in the world and just make Christian versions of it on Noah's Ark. So if there's secular art, we're going to make Christian art. If there's secular music, we're going to make mediocre Christian music. If there's secular coloring books, we're going to make Christian coloring books. If there's secular lingerie, we're going to make Christian lingerie. If there's secular anything, we're going to just make a Christian version of it, and we'll be safe in Noah's Ark. Now, how do we do evangelism from Noah's Ark? Not very well at all. Here's how evangelism works from Noah's Ark. Uncle Joe floats by. Uncle Joe, he's family. Let's save Uncle Joe. I've got a life preserver here. We'll throw it out. We'll bring down one guy into our boat. After all, he's family. He's Uncle Joe. Joe, you're going to fit in perfectly here. You know, you're going to like the food we have. You're going to like the music we sing. You're going to just fit in right here in the culture of this particular ark. Then a neighbor of yours floats by, and you stop and you go, wait a minute now. He borrowed my mower about 2 weeks ago. He hasn't given it back yet. But not only that, we're just not sure he's going to fit in on the culture of this ark. See, we clap 1-3 here, and he's going to 1 clap 2-4. That's just going to mess us up. That's just not going to work. You know, we like our food a certain way, and we only brought 1 bottle of sriracha, and he's going to eat that up in just 1 day. It's just not going to work for him to be on this ark. We have a way of doing things. We have music that we like. We have a cultural expression that we like. The last thing we need is someone who's going to disrupt that. Maybe there's another ark down the street that's more for his kind of people. And what that led to was a hyper-segregation in the American church. There's been a lot of studies on this. My provost at North American University, Michael Emerson, has written some phenomenal works on race and culture and integration of multi-ethnic churches. And one of the statistics that he looks at is looking at the level of segregation in the church. And a lot of it is due to this Noah's Ark approach to church ministry, where we will only take people that look like us, or think like us, or talk like us, or act like us. And in the process of doing that, we have this extreme segregation in the American church. So the example that Michael gives is that he looked at the 10 most segregated cities in the United States. By the way, anybody know which was number 1? It was not in the South. A lot of people said, I think like 8 out of the 10 were in the North. It was actually Milwaukee. Chicago was in the top 3, Detroit was in the top 5. The most segregated city in the United States is actually Milwaukee, Wisconsin. A side note on this. Because Milwaukee is hyper-segregated, their index is like in the high 9s out of 10. Because Milwaukee is hyper-segregated, there was a lot more possibility of economic and political injustice because of the level of segregation. So the example of this is that several years ago, I had friends who pastored in the inner city of Milwaukee or in the urban neighborhoods in Milwaukee. And what he told me is that when the governor at that time, he might still be the governor, made national news for drastic fiscal cuts. And everybody said, oh, he's a wonderful governor, he's balancing the budget and he's cutting the budget. And one of the things he cut was not just the education budget, but was the transportation budget. And what happened with the transportation budget is because Milwaukee was so segregated, when they cut the budget, they kept the transportation for the white neighborhoods, but then the segregated neighborhoods didn't get the transportation. So it looked like across-the-board budget cuts, but it cut the end of the lines, which is where the African Americans live in that community. So because of that hyper-segregation, what seemed like a good thing to do ultimately ended up being a racially charged action, which cut off African Americans from the city. So the more segregation you have, the more opportunities for injustice to come into that system. So Mike Emerson was looking at the level of segregation in urban centers and in major urban city areas compared to segregation in the church. And he looked at the 10 most segregated cities, and again, it would be like Milwaukee, Chicago, Gary, Indiana, Patterson, New Jersey, I think there was 2 cities in the South, and looked at these segregated cities and found that they had an index of about 0.61. The way he gauged that index is what percentage of that city would have to have what percentage of disruption would be needed for there to be integration. So if an index of 0.61 means that if you go into a neighborhood, 61% of that neighborhood would have to have disruption in order for there to be integration. Meaning you would have to move, or you would have a new neighbor, and then you would have integration. So the higher the number, the more extreme the segregation. The 10 most segregated cities in the U.S. have an index of 0.61. The American Evangelical Church has a segregation index of 0.91. So we are doing 30 percentage points worse than the 10 most segregated cities in the United States. Michael goes on to say that the only other time you had that level of segregation of 0.91 in any institution in the United States, the only other time that has happened, Deep South during Jim Crow laws. That was the only other time we had that level of segregation. And yet here we are as an American Evangelical Church with that extreme level of segregation. And it goes back to this idea, we are Noah's Ark, afraid of the changes in the world around us, so we're going to hide out for our comfort and safety in Noah's Ark. And I set this as a backdrop for what's going on currently, because there are still changes that are occurring in our city. But now this is not about European immigration, and it's not about Great Migration, but it's a whole new class of immigration that has started from 1965 forward. We'll go to the next slide. From 1965 forward, we have had a huge influx of non-European immigration. 1965 is the key date here. Most of you know this. That was the year that there was a change in the immigration laws of the United States. One thing to note about this change, this was not a throwing open the doors and let's let all the immigrants come in who want to. That has never, ever happened in American history except after Columbus got lost and found his way here. And the Native Americans graciously said, we will share our land with you. That's the only other time that's happened, only time that's happened in the history of North America. There's never been a moment in U.S. history where we're going to throw open the doors and let everybody in. That's never happened, and that didn't happen in 1965. What happened in 1965 was that in 1964, if you look at the distribution of immigration, it was mostly European immigration. It favored European immigration. What 1965 says is we're going to still have the same pie, same size, maybe grow it an inch a year for the next 40 years, but it's still roughly the same size pie. We're just going to cut the pie a little bit differently. So instead of just from Europe, now we're getting immigration from Asia, from Latin America. And what it did is it reversed centuries of laws that said we only will take certain types of people. The first of these laws was called the Chinese Exclusion Act. Can somebody guess what the Chinese Exclusion Act did? They weren't even trying to hide this. We're trying to exclude people. We're trying to exclude Chinese people with the Chinese Exclusion Act. This was not like the Volstead Act. It was pretty clear. We are going to exclude Chinese people, and we're going to make a law that says we're going to exclude Chinese people. So the laws like that said we don't want certain types of people, we only want certain types of people, those laws were changed in 1965. So it did away with, we won't take Chinese people, we won't take 5 Japanese people. Now we will take, within these boundaries of X number of immigrants per year, we will take this number of immigrants. But again, we still have a quota system We don't have unlimited immigration. In fact, if you're living in the Philippines right now, and you want to immigrate to the United States using conventional means, you have a 25 to 35-year waiting list. That's when you will be able to come into the U.S. A 25 to 35-year waiting list. So we don't have this uncontrolled immigration right now. We have a very controlled immigration, and that's still been since 1965. But once the shape of that pie began to change, it did begin to change the face of America in a slow, incremental way. And for the last 50, 60 years, we've had this influx of non-European immigrants, non-white immigrants into the U.S. The last four numbers are the ones you're probably familiar with. By 2008, we've already passed this number. A third of the U.S. population were not of European descent. So we passed that number already in 2008. 2011, census is saying 2011, 2012, somewhere in that range. So about 5 years ago, half of all the children born in America were not of European descent. And that number is never going down below 50. It's just the numbers game. It's going to keep inching its way up higher and higher. The birth rate will remain at 50% and higher of non-European descent. The latest number is that this year, 2016, was the first year where the incoming kindergarten class was not of European majority. So now we're talking about our schools being of non-European majority, or anybody under the age of 5, anybody under the age of 6. By 2023, half the children in America, anybody under the age of 18, are going to be of majority non-European descent. And of course, this number leads to 2042, where we will have the majority of all Americans not be of one race or ethnicity. We're going to have a non-majority minority in American society. What I want to point out is that the 2011 number and the 2016 number about the kindergarten class, and the 2023 number and the 2042 number, those numbers are linked together. Meaning the browning of America, the diversity of America, is not tied to immigration, it's tied to birth rates. So the browning of America is inevitable because we crossed a birth rate threshold already. So you can push it back a year, push it up a year, it doesn't matter, it is going to happen. So no matter how big a wall Donald Trump gets Mexico to build for us, that won't change a thing. It won't change a thing. You will never be able to make America white again. This reality is the reality that our cities, our country is going to have to deal with. Now, one of the fears of this reality, the browning of America, more immigrants coming in, more non-Europeans kind of in our school system, the first fear was actually put forth by a Harvard professor by the name of Diana Eck. And she said, the more immigrants we get, the more diverse we become as a nation, the more pluralistic we're going to become as in our religion. So we're going to be de-Christianized because immigrants are going to bring their immigrant faith with them. She had about $1 million to do this research. I don't know what she did with $1 million, but I don't think it was research. Because her findings were just completely off. It turns out that the influx of immigrants has not meant the decline of Christianity in America. It's actually meant the saving of Christianity in America. Go to the next slide. Stephen Warner at the University of Illinois puts it this way. Go to the next slide, sorry. Stephen Warner at the University of Illinois in Chicago says, what we're seeing is not the de-Christianization of America, but the de-Europeanization of American Christianity. You see the difference there? So we're not seeing the de-Christianization. If you look at some of the numbers, especially in evangelical Christianity, the numbers are relatively flatline, meaning the percentage of those who identify as evangelical is relatively flat. But if you take out immigrant churches, African-American churches, second-generation Asian churches, the churches of non-European descent, that number starts looking like this. So the decline of the church in America is not the decline of Christianity, it's the decline of white Christianity in America. And that's only being saved and redeemed by the influx of Asian churches, Spanish churches, African-American churches, multi-ethnic churches. These churches are saving Christianity in America. So what happened was that people started getting freaked out. We've got a Buddhist temple in our neighborhood. It wasn't there 25 years ago, and now we've got a Buddhist temple. What are we going to do? They're taking over our neighborhood. We've got this Buddhist temple in our neighborhood. Now we can look at these changes, and like a previous generation, that makes us very nervous. That makes us very nervous about what is happening in the world around us. And we could run away and hide in Noah's Ark. Or we could say, thanks be to God, because He has brought spiritual reinforcements into this nation. He has brought hope through the immigrant church. The immigrant church that knows more about suffering than the established churches know. And their theology of suffering is going to be a corrective that we need for our theology of affluence that we have lived into for so long. The influx of immigrants, the new communities that we see, is not the death of American Christianity. It is the salvation of American Christianity. Now, if I haven't been controversial enough, let's ramp it up a little bit more. We'll ramp it up a little bit more by talking about, okay, we love the Christian immigrants that come into our neighborhood. We'll have a pulpit swap with that Korean immigrant church. We'll do a helping project for that Vietnamese Catholic congregation. Of course, those are great. But what about, yes, there is a percentage who are not Christian. And what is going to be our attitude towards that? Let me give a little background here. I went to college 30 years ago, and I was a Christian, and I was part of a university group, and one of the things we would do within the university is we would pray for the mission field. I think that's a practice that we've lost, but I think we should regain that practice of the idea of praying for other countries and other nations. And what I remember when I was in college and in the seminary was that we were praying a lot for one particular unreached people. And that was the #1 topic. Books were written about it. Mission conferences focused on it. And that group was the communist countries. That was the #1 prayer topic about missions. Let's reach the Iron Curtain countries. Let's pray for the fall of the Iron Curtain. Let's pray the gospel goes into Eastern Europe, into the Soviet Union, into China. We want to see the gospel go into these places that are closed to the gospel. And mission agencies and mission prayer books all said, pray for the communist bloc. And we did. And guess what? God answered our prayer. Praise be to God, God answered our prayer. The Iron Curtain did fall. My last year in seminary, my missions professor was an Eastern European. I mean, think about that for a minute. And if all the numbers are correct, China is right now the most Christian nation in the world. Their numbers range from anywhere from 30 million to 250 million Christians in the nation of China. The 30 million is a government number. It's probably way underestimated. The 250 includes the house church movements that are very hard to track, but it's probably the more accurate number. Meaning, China is either already or very close to becoming the most Christian nation in the world. In other words, God has answered our prayer. Thanks be to God. Yes, amen. Now, what happened is that we switched our prayers for the communist nations. And then after that, the mission agencies and the mission books and the mission prayers started to focus on a new group of people. And what group did we start praying for? Muslims. Muslims. And for the last 25 years, we have been praying for the Muslim community. We have had mission conferences, and if you look at the number of books on reaching the Muslim community over and over again, there are so many books on this, and prayer meeting after prayer meeting, and guess what? God has answered our prayer. But guess what? It's American evangelicals that stand at the gates of the airport and say, we don't want the 2,500 refugees from Syria. They might be terrorists. In the same way they said, we don't want these boat people from Vietnam. They might be communists. And we don't want these Jews from Germany. They're going to bring a whole different perspective. So out of that fear comes this idea that even when God is working and bringing the nations to your next door neighbor, you're going to turn them away because of your fear. Because you want to run away and hide from the word of God. Should not Christians be at the airport saying, welcome to our nation, welcome to my neighborhood, welcome, we're going to throw a party on your behalf because you're here. And we're going to share the love of Christ with you, not the hatred of our nation, but the love of Christ with you. God has actually answered our prayer, and it's American Christians shutting the door on God's answer to prayer. Are we willing to embrace the work of God, to say the change in the demographics of American Christianity, the the change in the demographics of American society, the influx of new neighbors that we're maybe a little nervous about. This is an answer to decades of prayer. Thanks be to God. Thanks be to God. Our response then is not to run away and hide, but our response is to offer up a lament. A lament. And that's what we move towards in the book of Lamentations as the proper and appropriate response to the suffering that's happening and the changes that are happening in the world around us. We can go to slide number 18. Who wrote Lamentations? I'll give you this kind of one application point out of the book of Lamentations. One of the questions about the book of Lamentations is who wrote this book? Well, it turns out that there's a controversy around the authorship. I mentioned that all the exiles were those who could read or write, who could rebuild society. So there was very few candidates left who could read or write because those were taken away into exile, except Jeremiah. Jeremiah was actually allowed to stay behind, because if you read through the book of Jeremiah, what you discover is that Jeremiah said, give in to the Babylonians. You know, they're going to conquer you. So the Babylonians thought Jeremiah was on their side, so they allowed Jeremiah to stay behind. He would have been one of the very few who could actually read or write, so probably the best candidate to actually write down. Lamentations is actually fairly sophisticated poetry. You probably had someone with those writing skills to be able to write it down. Jeremiah is probably the one that can do that. The problem, though, is that if you compare the writing of Jeremiah and compare it to the writing in Lamentations, it's completely different styles of writing. Now, it's good writing on both ends, but it's just very different styles. So it's like, okay, you got Shakespeare and Tupac. Great poets, both of them. They just have slightly different styles of writing. So you've got Jeremiah and Lamentations. They're just slightly different styles of writing. So people have said, scholars have said, well, it couldn't have been Jeremiah because it's not a style of writing. Here's the way I would resolve that question. What Jeremiah is doing is he's going to the town square, or the city gate in this case, and he goes to the place where all those who have been left behind, those who are the most marginalized, the most suffering from that community, to gather around the city gate, and he listens and he writes down their story. So even though his voice comes in every once in a while as the prophet narrator, he really is reflecting the voice of the people. And not just the people, but the most broken, the most marginalized, the most suffering of that community. I argue that Lamentations is probably the most feminine book of the Bible, because it's more so than even Ruth and Esther, the voice of women come front and center. Jeremiah is listening to the voice of the widows and the orphans and those who have lost their husbands and those who have lost their children, the motherless and fatherless. He listens to them and he writes their story down and he tells their story. So he's not privileging his own voice as the prophet, as the educated, as the one who could read or write. He is prioritizing the voice of the most marginalized in his society. And that, I think, is what the church is missing as well. We are so intent on elevating the privileged voices that we fail to recognize God at work among the most marginalized in our society, and that they might be our best teachers in what's going on in the world around us. I have been really blessed with the opportunity for education. I have 2 master's degrees, 2 doctorate degrees, with the pleasure and gift and a wonderful honor of teaching at a seminary, teaching others. And I know that because of my education, because of my position, I'm in a place of extreme privilege. I've been allowed that privilege in American society because of my education, because of my position. What I also realize is that that's not where I necessarily come from. And that even if I speak as a person of privilege, I really need to reflect back my earlier story, where I was not a person of privilege. As an immigrant family, our family struggled quite a bit. My father left our family when I was about 11 years old. He abandoned our family, left my mom with 4 kids, 3 sisters and me, to try to raise 4 kids with very minimal language skills. She didn't speak much English. She was a recent immigrant with her family. We lived in a kind of a rough neighborhood in Baltimore, inner city Baltimore. She worked 2 very difficult jobs. During the day, from 10 a.m. to 10 p.m., she would go work at an inner city carryout in Baltimore. You know the type, right? It's the bulletproof glass in the front and the little lazy Susan to pass the money and the food back and forth. Where she was the one working at the counter and frying the fish and chicken and making the sandwiches and French fries. That was her job for many, many years, working from 10 a.m. to 10 p.m. in the inner city neighborhood in Baltimore. And then she would go from that job after a 12-hour shift she would drive over to a nursing home where she would work the night shift from 11 p.m. to about 6 or 7 a.m. And she would work the night shift as a nurse's aide, changing bedpans, answering calls from the inner city nursing home for senior citizens, a convalescence home, and she would help out there during the night shift. Then she would rush home to make breakfast for her kids, send us off to school, catch 2 hours of sleep, and then rush back to work at 10 a.m. She would do this 6 days a week. She would always keep the Sabbath. She would always make sure that we knew that Sunday was a holy day. And no matter how hard she worked during the week, she would get her kids up, take them to church, and then demonstrate even more servanthood by making the lunches for the deacons and the elders and the pastors of the church. So she lived a life where she gave sacrificially to her family and to her church. And I was thinking about this because I was just at a conference in Atlanta, and there was about 10,000 people. The topic was about uncommon fellowship. There were some themes of racial reconciliation there. There were 10 speakers, and 9 of them were white men. Thank you. And there were all these success stories, about we went into a city and we took over that city with a mega church. And we got all the artistic and banker types of our church. We're so excited about this. And that was kind of the story after story after story of how they took over a city with these hipster church plants. And I was like, these 10,000 people paid $500 in a registration fee, $500 for an airfare, $500 for 3 nights at the Hyatt, and then $500 for they spent $2,000 to go to a conference to hear a 29-year-old hipster pastor tell them what they already knew. I go to too many of these conferences to know. You're always told at these conferences exactly what you should already know. If you're a church planning pastor, you should not have to pay $2,000 to go to a conference and be told, be friendly to newcomers. You shouldn't have to be told that, but it shouldn't cost you $2,000. You shouldn't go to a Christian leadership conference and pay $2,000 to be told, as a leader, you should serve others. You shouldn't have to pay that kind of money for that. But I got disgusted, frankly, sitting here at the 10,000 people that have spent all this money to go to this conference. And church planning conferences, that you spend all this money, and people come up to me and say, so what's the secret of church planning? How do you plan an urban church like you did? How do you plan a multi-ethnic church? And I say, there is no secret except you just need a praying spouse and a praying mom. Yeah. The rest of the stuff you can figure out. It's the praying spouse and the praying mom that you desperately need. All the rest of the stuff, yeah, just be nice, be friendly. You don't need these kind of 3 steps to grow your church and make sure your restrooms are clean. I mean, urban restrooms are never ever clean. Come on, let's be real now. I mean, like if you're in an urban men's room, the urinal is like right next to the sink. It's only about that far away. So that's how you know you're in an urban church, when the urinal is about that far away from the sink. So we know that those are not the ways to grow the church. But we need praying spouses and praying moms. What I think what we've done in the American church is elevate the hipster, successful, big-name church pastors as our model, when it really should be the grandmas and the grandpas. Yeah. The immigrants who work 10-hour shifts and still pray hours upon hours a day. My mom is now in her 80s. She was diagnosed with dementia, Alzheimer's. So she's not as sharp as she used to be. But a few years ago, she showed me the condition of her knees, a couple of decades ago. And she lifted up to show me her knees. And, we have one kneecap on each knee. Her kneecap is 5 to 6 different pieces. Because she has knelt in prayer for so long that when she kneels now, her knees conform to the shape of the hardwood floor. And her kneecap split open and shaped to the shape of the floor. And her story is never told at these hipster conferences. Yeah. Her story is never discussed about how to build great churches, not big churches, but great churches. Her stories are never lifted up as the model of what Christianity can be in the United States. A single mom, immigrant, who works long hours to keep her family together, but who is on her knees every single night, every single morning, to the point that her knees have completely broken and fallen apart. Those are the stories we need to hear. So I challenge you as a community here in St. Louis. Will you hear each other The story of the immigrant family who will go to that church prayer meeting at 5 o'clock in the morning. And what we learn, even though they speak a broken English, even though they don't get all the symbols and customs of American culture, what we learn from those immigrant families. What we learn from the newly displaced refugees who, despite all the trials and circumstances, are still seeking for answers, and what would be that place of hope and grace and mercy and love to those families. St. Louis, if you're looking for a big church to come and save this city, you're looking in the wrong place. If you're looking for a hotshot young guy to come from a big-time church elsewhere to come and save your city, you're looking in the wrong place. Look around you. Look at your neighbors that have just moved in. Look at the churches that are in the storefronts of your neighborhoods. Look at the churches that are meeting in the basement of people's homes. Look at the churches that are drawing from the ethnic and immigrant and the most marginalized communities in your neighborhood and in your city. That's where the move of God is going to be. Lament alongside those communities. Hear their voices. Lamentation means you hear all of the voices that are present, even the most suffering and the most marginalized. Let St. Louis become a city where those voices rise up. Lord, I thank you for the work that you are doing here, the good work that you are calling this community to. Raise up a people, oh God, not one individual who stands up as the superstar, not even a group of individuals who are the hotshot pastors, but raise up a people, oh God. Raise up a church, oh God. Raise up churches, oh God. Raise up your people so that the world will look at St. Louis and say, not one big church or one mega church, but all these amazing churches. The Bosnian church, the Spanish-speaking storefront church, the African-American churches, the Korean churches, the Vietnamese Catholic congregation, that all these churches are part of the move of God. And let these churches be united on one purpose, to worship and glorify the King of Kings and Lord of Lords, no matter what that might take, whether it is marching the streets, whether it is all-night prayer meetings, whether it is standing up in City Hall against the powers that be in this society, whatever it may be, Lord, raise up a church that lifts up the name of Jesus. And we do it all together. For Lord, that is your promise in your word. Let the people of God say, amen.